My name is Angela, and I never imagined my life would end that day. It was supposed to be just another winter morning, cold but peaceful. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale glow over the frozen streets. Everything outside lay beneath a thick layer of ice, the trees standing motionless under the weight of frost. The world felt quiet, untouched, as if time itself had slowed. I pulled my coat tighter around me as I stepped outside, my breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The neighborhood was still asleep, the only sound coming from the faint crunch of ice beneath my boots. My mind was already elsewhere, thinking about the errands I had to run, the work that awaited me, the calls I needed to make. Just another day, just another morning. Then, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. Before I could react, my foot slipped. One moment, I was heading toward my car, keys gripped tightly in my gloved hand. The next, the ground vanished beneath me. I had no time to catch myself, no way to stop what was coming. My body lurched backward, and in an instant my head struck the icy pavement. A sharp pain shot through me, but it lasted only a second. Then everything blurred. The sky above twisted. The pale morning light flickered like a candle about to go out. My ears rang, and then silence. The biting cold that had numbed my skin moments ago disappeared. The pain in my head, gone. The weight of my body, vanished. It was as if I had been lifted out of myself. I should have panicked. I should have felt fear, confusion, something, but instead I felt the exact opposite. Warmth, not just physical warmth, like stepping into a cozy room after being out in the snow. This was deeper. It filled me completely, embracing me in a way I had never known before. It wasn't just comfort, it was peace. I opened my eyes, but I was no longer on the freezing ground. The winter sky, the ice-covered pavement, my neighborhood, all of it was gone. I was somewhere else. Light surrounded me, not harsh or artificial, but a soft, living glow that came from everywhere at once. There were no shadows, no dark corners. The light wasn't just illuminating the space, it was the space. I took a step forward, yet my feet didn't feel the ground the way they should have. I wasn't floating, but I wasn't weighed down either. There was no heaviness, no strain, just freedom, as if I had been released from something I never even realized was holding me back. Then I felt it, a presence. I didn't hear footsteps. There was no sound to announce that someone was near. But I knew. I wasn't alone. The warmth around me deepened, filling me with something more powerful than peace, something I could only describe as love. I turned, and there he was. I'd never seen him like this before, yet I knew him instantly. There was no doubt, no hesitation. Jesus. I had spent my whole life believing in him, praying to him, calling his name. But standing here face to face, I realized no words, no sermons, no songs could have ever captured what it meant to be in his presence. It wasn't just how he looked, it was who he was. In that moment, I was completely known. Every thought I had ever had, every joy, every mistake, every doubt. And yet, there was no judgment, no shame, only love. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything. But before I could, he lifted his hand ever so slightly. And I understood. Not in words, not in sound, but in a way that went beyond both. I didn't need to ask where I was. I already knew. I had died. But death was not what I thought it would be. It wasn't an end. It wasn't darkness. It was something far greater. It wasn't an end. It was a transition, a crossing from one existence to another. But there was something about this moment that felt significant, as if this wasn't the conclusion of my journey, but the beginning of something else entirely. Jesus looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something unexpected. Love, peace, yes, but also something deeper, a sorrow, a longing. Not for himself, but for what he was about to show me. "There is something you need to see," he said. The moment those words left his lips, everything shifted. The radiant light surrounding us didn't vanish, but it softened, dimmed, just slightly. And before I could fully grasp what was happening, the world around me changed. I wasn't in that peaceful place anymore. I was somewhere else. And what I saw next changed everything I thought I knew. The world before me was nothing like the one I'd just left. I was no longer lying on the frozen pavement, no longer feeling the sting of the cold, no longer bound by the weight of my own body. Instead, I stood in a place that felt more real than anything I had ever known. The very air around me felt alive, carrying a warmth that wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something that touched every part of me. Light filled the space, but it didn't come from a single source. It wasn't like sunlight or a glowing lamp. It was everywhere at once, surrounding me, wrapping around me in a way that made me feel completely safe, completely at peace. It wasn't blinding, yet it was more brilliant than any light I had ever seen. I looked down at myself, expecting to see my coat, my gloves, my boots, everything I had been wearing before I fell, but none of it was there. In fact, I wasn't even sure if I had a body in the way I had always known it. I could move, I could think, I could feel, but there was no pain, no cold, no weight pressing down on me. It was as if I was still me, but without all the limitations that had come with being human. And then, before I could even begin to comprehend what was happening, I felt something beyond the light, beyond the warmth. It wasn't something I could see or hear, yet I knew, without a doubt, I was not alone. I turned, and there he was. I didn't need anyone to tell me who he was. There was no hesitation, no question in my heart or mind. I knew. Jesus stood just a few feet away, watching me with eyes that held more love than I had ever known. He didn't have to say a word. In that single moment, with just one look, I felt everything. My entire life was laid bare before him, not in a way that made me feel ashamed, but in a way that made me realize how deeply he had always known me. Every thought, every joy, every sorrow, every mistake, every regret. He saw it all. And yet, there was no condemnation in his gaze, no anger, no disappointment, only love. A love so deep, so complete, so unlike anything I had ever experienced that it made every other version of love I'd ever known seem small in comparison. I wanted to speak, to ask where I was, what was happening, why I was standing before him instead of waking up in a hospital somewhere. But the words never came. Not because I couldn't speak, but because I didn't need to. He already knew. Then he finally spoke. There is something you need to see. The moment the words left his lips, the world around us changed again. The light didn't vanish, but it shifted. The warmth remained, but suddenly I was no longer in that peaceful space. The ground beneath me felt solid, and then I realized we were no longer alone. I turned, and what I saw felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. I saw people, cities, streets filled with movement. At first glance, everything seemed normal. People going about their lives, talking, working, laughing, carrying on with their daily routines. But the longer I watched, the more I noticed. Something was wrong. Jesus stood beside me, silent, watching, waiting for me to see what he already knew. At first, I didn't understand. I saw families gathering, people attending church, communities coming together. It all looked so ordinary. But then, the truth became clear. There was division everywhere, not just in the way people spoke or interacted, but in their hearts. I saw it in the way they looked at one another, the unspoken judgments, the hidden resentments, the deep-rooted anger passed down through generations. I saw people clinging to pain, refusing to let go of the past, using it as a reason to keep others at a distance. I saw groups separating themselves, building walls that were never meant to exist. And then I saw something even more heartbreaking. Even within the churches, the division remained. They called themselves one body, one faith, one people under God, and yet they stood divided. I saw congregations that claimed to worship the same God but refused to stand together, people who spoke of unity but lived in separation, places where love was preached but not practiced. And as I watched, I realized something heartbreaking. Most of them had no idea what they had lost. They do not see each other as I see them, Jesus said, his voice carrying a sorrow that settled deep in my chest. I turned to him, my heart heavy. Why is it like this? They have forgotten, he said simply. The weight of those words pressed into me. I understood what he meant. Humanity had been made in his image, every person crafted by his hand, carrying a part of his love. But somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing each other that way. We started defining ourselves by things that were never meant to divide us: race, nationality, status, culture. Instead of building bridges, we built walls. And for the first time, I saw just how deep those walls had been built. I watched as people carried wounds that weren't even their own, pain passed down through generations shaping the way they treated one another. Some held onto their suffering so tightly it hardened into anger. Others ignored the pain altogether, refusing to acknowledge the weight of what had been done. And in the middle of it all, I saw a world blind to the very thing that could heal it: him. I looked at Jesus, and his expression was unreadable. But in his eyes I saw something I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just sadness. It was urgency. And in that moment I knew this wasn't just something I was meant to see. This was something I was meant to do something about. Before I could even process that thought, the world around me shifted. Suddenly I wasn't standing in the warmth of that endless light anymore. The peace, the stillness, the overwhelming presence of love. It was gone. I was somewhere else entirely. I wasn't just in the world. I was above it. Below me, the earth stretched out in all directions. Cities stood tall. Streets bustled with movement. People filled every space I could see. Crowded markets, quiet suburbs, towering skyscrapers, humble homes. At first it all looked so normal. But then I started to see, not just with my eyes, but with understanding. People weren't just divided by land or language or culture. They were separated by something much deeper, something that had taken root in their hearts. I saw it in the way they moved through their daily lives, passing each other in the streets, standing side by side in stores, even sitting in the same rooms, yet feeling worlds apart. I saw it in their eyes, the subtle judgments, the silent hesitations, the unspoken assumptions passed down like heirlooms. I saw groups turning against groups. I saw the weight of history, old wounds that had never fully healed, turning into fresh resentments. Some had suffered oppression, and the pain of it had sunk so deeply into their souls that it became anger, a quiet, simmering rage that shaped their view of the world. Others clung to power, afraid of what would happen if they let go, afraid to see others rise, afraid of losing something they believed was theirs to keep. Jesus stood beside me, watching it all unfold. There was sorrow in his expression, not anger, not frustration, just a deep, aching sadness for what had become of his creation. "All were made in my image," he said, his voice carrying a weight that sent a shiver through me. "But look at what has happened." His words lingered in the air, pressing into me, forcing me to truly take in what I was seeing. This wasn't just a surface-level problem. This wasn't just about misunderstandings or disagreements. This was spiritual. I looked closer and saw how tightly people clung to their identities, not as children of God, but as something else. Some held on to their race, their nationality, their status, their affiliations, as if those things defined their worth, as if they were the most important part of who they were. They placed those identities above everything else, even above God. I saw people using past wounds as reasons to build walls, reasons to hate, reasons to stay separate. I saw others who refused to acknowledge history at all, choosing blindness over understanding, silence over reconciliation. It was painful to witness, and as the weight of it settled over me, I realized something I had never understood before. This was not how things were meant to be. This was not what God had intended for his people. They do not see each other as I see them, Jesus said again, his voice filled with something deeper than sorrow. It was heartbreak, and it was hope. I looked up at him, my heart heavy with the weight of the truth he was revealing. "Why is it like this?" I asked, even though deep down I already knew the answer. "They have forgotten," he replied softly. In that moment, it clicked. I understood exactly what he meant. Humanity had been created in his image, each person crafted by his hand, each soul a reflection of his love. But somewhere along the way, people had stopped seeing that. Instead of embracing their shared identity in Christ, they started defining themselves by things that were never meant to separate them. Race, nationality, social status, political views. These differences became walls, not bridges, and over time, people had let those walls overshadow the truth of who they were. I saw how it had spread into every corner of society, how it shaped cultures, families, even the way people spoke, thought about, and treated each other. This wasn't just about history or injustice. It was about how people had allowed divisions to grow bigger than love, bigger than forgiveness, bigger than their calling to be united in him. And then, something made my stomach sink even further. The division wasn't just in the world, it was in the church. I saw congregations where people worshipped the same God, read the same Bible, followed the same Savior, and yet they remained apart. Some churches were divided by race, others by culture, still others by unspoken lines that kept people separate even when they sat in the same room. I saw believers who claimed to follow Christ, but still carried prejudice in their hearts. I saw others who were blind to the ways they had contributed to the separation. "This isn't how it was meant to be," Jesus said, his eyes full of sorrow as he stood beside me. His voice was quiet, but filled with certainty. I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it all. How had things become this way? People had convinced themselves that their differences mattered more than their unity, that their pain, their struggles, their experiences were too great to overcome. But what they had forgotten was that none of those things could compare to the love of God. None of them could compare to the sacrifice Jesus made for every single person, regardless of where they came from, what they looked like, or what they had been through. The enemy had blinded them, twisting their vision and making them believe they were too different, too divided, to ever truly be one. And because of that, people had stopped trying. I turned back to Jesus, my chest tight with emotion. "Can it be changed?" His eyes met mine, filled with the same love I had seen from the beginning. "They must remember who they are," he said simply. "They must return to me." It wasn't just about acknowledging the problem. It wasn't just about admitting that division existed. It was about going back to the truth, the one thing that could heal what had been broken. People had spent so much time looking at each other through the lens of the world, through history, pain, and differences, that they had stopped looking at one another through the eyes of God. And until that changed, nothing else would. I felt the weight of his words settle deep into my soul. This wasn't just something I had been allowed to see. It was something I was meant to understand, something I was meant to carry with me when I returned, if I returned, because in that moment I didn't know if I would. All I knew was that this truth, this painful, undeniable reality, had been placed in front of me for a reason. And somehow, I knew that what Jesus was about to show me next would be even more important. The vision shifted again, and I suddenly saw time moving in a way I had never experienced before. It was as if I was standing outside of history, watching it unfold, like pages of a book flipping too quickly for me to grasp any one moment completely. Yet, I understood everything that was happening. I saw the rise and fall of civilizations, the shaping of nations, and how humanity had divided itself over and over again. At first, the images were beautiful. People working together, building, creating, discovering. But then, something changed. I saw families torn apart, people forced from their homes, their freedom taken away. I saw chains, whips, ships filled with human beings treated as less than human. I saw faces filled with pain, fear, and hopelessness, slavery, war, oppression. These were things I had read about, things I'd learned in history books, but now I saw them through the eyes of those who had lived it. The suffering didn't stop when the chains were removed or when the wars ended. It lingered, passed down from generation to generation. Some carried anger, others carried guilt, and some carried wounds so deep that they never fully healed. Jesus stood beside me, watching it all. His sorrow was almost too much to bear. "They were meant to love one another," he said quietly, "but they chose fear instead." I continued to watch as history moved forward. The names and faces changed, but the division remained. Some were told they were lesser because I saw people clinging to power, afraid to lose their place, afraid to confront the wrongs done before them. Then I witnessed leaders, strong voices rising at different points in time. Some fought for justice, healing, and unity, while others exploited division for their own gain. Some were politicians, convincing people that hatred was necessary to protect themselves, telling them that unity was impossible. They spread the idea that the only way to survive was to stay separated, to fear those who were different. They disguised control as security, turning people against each other, feeding their insecurities and pain instead of offering true solutions. But it wasn't just politicians. I saw religious leaders, people who were supposed to represent God, standing behind pulpits and preaching messages that deepened the divide instead of healing it. Some twisted scripture to justify oppression, using the words of God to support their own biases. Others chose to ignore the suffering of those around them, pretending injustice didn't exist because it was easier to turn a blind eye. I didn't want to watch, but I couldn't look away. I saw people absorbing these messages, believing them, letting them shape the way they saw each other, the world, and even themselves. And the enemy, he was watching too. He whispered lies into the ears of the powerful, the hurting, and even those who wanted to do what was right but didn't know how. It wasn't just about race. It wasn't just about power. It was about division in every form. I saw people fighting over things that didn't matter, over status, wealth, and traditions. I saw people who claimed to love God refusing to love their neighbors because of differences that should have never even been an issue. Families were broken, communities torn apart, churches split over arguments that had nothing to do with eternity. And then I saw something even more heartbreaking. Even within the walls of the church, the division remained. Some congregations were completely separated, their members all looking the same, living the same, never opening their doors to anyone different. Some preached unity, but lived in quiet segregation, never reaching beyond their comfort zones, never asking why the divide still existed. Others refused to acknowledge the pain of the past, acting as if history had no impact on the present, expecting people to just move on without understanding what had been done. Jesus looked at me, his voice filled with sorrow yet firm, sending chills through me. "This is not what I wanted," he said. "I made them all, I love them all, but they have forgotten." The weight of his words settled deep into my soul. The truth was painful, but undeniable. Humanity had forgotten who they were. They had forgotten that they were all created by the same hands, loved by the same God. They had allowed themselves to be divided, believing the lie that they were meant to be separate, that their differences mattered more than their shared humanity. I turned to Jesus, my heart aching. "How do they fix it?" I asked. "How do they undo what's already been done?" His expression didn't change. "They must return to me," he said simply. "Only my love can heal what the world has broken." The vision shifted again, and I felt my soul brace itself for what was to come. I knew that what I had seen so far was only part of the truth. There was more I needed to understand, more I had to carry back with me. And deep down, I knew the answer wasn't just for the world. It was for me too. Jesus lifted his hand, and in an instant, my perspective changed. I was no longer watching from the outside, no longer observing history like a bystander. Instead, I saw people the way he saw them, and it was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I didn't see race. I didn't see nationality. I didn't see the markers humanity had used to separate itself for so long. I saw souls, and they were all the same. There was no division, no hierarchy, no one standing above another. There were no privileged and no forgotten, no chosen and no rejected. Each soul carried the same value, the same light, the same essence of God's love. There was no such thing as someone being worth more because of where they were born or what they looked like. There was no such thing as someone being worth less because of the circumstances they had been born into. They were his, and that was the only thing that mattered. And then I saw the pain. I saw people who had been hurt by racism, oppression, and rejection. I saw their wounds, not physical but spiritual, etched deeply into their very souls. Some carried scars passed down through generations, wounds that had never been allowed to heal, pain that had been reinforced time and time again by the world around them. And Jesus felt their pain. I could see it in his eyes, in the way he looked at them. He wasn't distant from their suffering. He had been there, in every moment of their oppression, in every injustice. I saw people who had been made to feel less than what God had created them to be. He had seen every insult, every act of exclusion, and every cruel moment, and he had wept for them. He had never turned away. But then something unexpected happened. I saw people who had been falsely accused, burdened with guilt for things they never did. People carrying the weight of history on their shoulders, even though their hands had never caused harm. Some had been born into privilege they never asked for, and lived in fear of being hated simply because of the past. Others had tried to help, tried to bring healing, but had been rejected, told they would never understand. And Jesus felt their pain too. He saw those struggling to reconcile history with their present, those who wanted to make things right but didn't know how. He had witnessed people attempting to bridge the gap, only to be met with suspicion, met with walls built from years of hurt. He had seen how division was kept alive, not just by those who wanted to oppress, but by those who had been so deeply wounded that they didn't know how to move forward without carrying the past with them. It was all pain, and Jesus carried it all. In that moment, I understood the truth. The answer wasn't to ignore race, to pretend history hadn't happened, or to act as though the pain of the past had no effect on the present. The answer wasn't to dismiss the wounds of those who had suffered, nor was it to blame those who hadn't committed the sins of their ancestors. The answer wasn't to hold on to anger or let guilt divide people even more. The answer was him. Only his love could heal what the world had broken. For the first time, I saw how the enemy had used race as a tool to divide people. He had taken something beautiful, God's creation of diversity, culture, and uniqueness, and twisted it into something that caused pain, separation, and hatred. Instead of seeing different races as expressions of God's creativity, people had been taught to see them as barriers, as reasons to stay apart, as excuses to elevate one group over another. I realized how much time humanity had wasted fighting battles God never intended for them to fight. Jesus had never created one race to be superior to another. He had never chosen one group to be above the rest. Every single human being was created with the same love, the same purpose, to know Him and love one another. Yet the world had twisted this truth. People had been conditioned to believe that their differences were more important than their unity. They had been led to think that their skin color, their nationality, their background defined them more than their identity as children of God. Some were taught to see themselves as less, while others were taught to see themselves as greater. In the end, they had all forgotten the truth. I saw what the world had gotten wrong. It wasn't wrong to acknowledge race, to see the beauty in different cultures, or to recognize that history had left wounds that needed healing. But it was wrong to let those things become more important than the love of Christ. It was wrong to let past pain dictate future relationships. It was wrong to let anger and division grow stronger than the call to forgive and unite. Then I watched as Jesus stretched out His hand. Suddenly people were reaching for one another, choosing love over resentment, choosing reconciliation over separation. They chose to see each other as God saw them, not as the world had conditioned them to see. I saw churches breaking down the walls that had kept them apart for so long. Families were learning to heal, to talk, to listen. I saw people letting go of bitterness, not because their pain didn't matter, but because they refused to let it define them anymore. And for the first time, I saw hope. Jesus looked at me again, and I knew exactly what He was telling me. This wasn't just a vision for me to witness. It was a truth I needed to take back with me, a message that had to be spoken. The world would continue to tell people that they were too different, too divided, too broken to ever come together. But Jesus had already paid the price for their unity. He had already made a way for healing. He had already provided the only solution that could truly mend what had been torn apart. People just needed to see it. They needed to see each other the way He saw them. And that was the only way everything would change. The vision shifted once again, and what I saw next was beyond anything I could have imagined. After witnessing the pain, the division, and the weight of history that had shaped how people saw one another, I was shown something different. Something I never thought I would see in this world. I saw forgiveness, not just words, not forced gestures, but true, deep, and complete forgiveness. I saw people who had carried the weight of resentment for years, decades even, suddenly letting it go. It was as if they had been holding on to chains they never realized were wrapped around their hearts. But in an instant, those chains were broken. I watched as individuals who had endured real oppression, mistreatment, and rejection chose to move forward, not by forgetting what had happened, but by refusing to let it control them any longer. I saw people embracing one another, weeping together, and breaking down the walls that had kept them apart. It wasn't shallow. It wasn't forced. It was real. Jesus stood beside me, watching with an expression full of love. "This is what I desire," He said, "that they love one another." I saw churches coming together, not out of obligation, but because they truly saw each other as family. No longer were there separate places of worship for different groups, no unspoken divisions keeping people in their corners. Instead, they gathered as one body, united under the same kingdom. It wasn't about flags, nationalities, or social status. It wasn't about history or tradition. They were simply God's people, standing together, worshipping together, and living together in unity. It was something so simple, yet the world had complicated it. The enemy had spent generations convincing people that unity was impossible, that their differences were too great to overcome, that the wounds of the past could never heal. But Jesus was showing me the truth. What could happen if people just chose to see each other the way he saw them? I saw families teaching their children not to carry the burdens of division into the next generation. Parents told their sons and daughters that they didn't have to inherit hatred, that they could choose a different path. I saw young people refusing to let history dictate their relationships, choosing instead to build something new, something that looked like heaven on earth. This is how they move forward, Jesus said, not by ignoring what has happened, but by choosing love despite it. Those words sank deep into my soul. For so long, the world had taught people that moving forward meant pretending the past didn't exist or using it as fuel for more division. But neither of those paths led to healing. True healing came not from forgetting, but from acknowledging the pain and choosing love anyway. I saw people reaching across barriers that once seemed impossible to cross. I saw churches inviting one another in, no longer seeing themselves as separate groups, but as one body in Christ. People were no longer defining themselves by the color of their skin, their background, or their nationality, but simply by their identity as children of God. Then I saw something even more powerful. I saw leaders choosing truth over fear, political leaders, pastors, teachers, people who had once been afraid to speak about unity, unsure of how to address it, now stood boldly and declared what Jesus had always wanted: love, unity, and reconciliation. Not as distant dreams, but as a way of life. For so long, people had been afraid to talk about race, injustice, and division. Some had avoided the conversation altogether, while others had used it to stir up anger and pain. But I saw leaders who were no longer afraid. They weren't afraid to acknowledge the hurt caused by racism. They weren't afraid to speak about the wounds left by the past. And they weren't afraid to say that Jesus was the only answer. They weren't afraid to call people to repentance, not just those who had caused harm, but also those who had refused to forgive. They boldly declared that the world's way of solving division had failed, and that the only way forward was through Jesus alone. I saw revival, not just in churches, but in homes, schools, governments, and communities. It wasn't a revival where people simply filled church pews. It was a revival of the heart. People were waking up, realizing they had spent too long letting the enemy keep them apart, letting history define their future, and letting bitterness hold them back from the freedom Jesus had already paid for. And I saw something else too. I saw people truly listening to one another, not listening to respond, not listening to argue, but listening to understand. I saw people willing to hear each other's pain without getting defensive. Those who had suffered found peace in knowing their pain was acknowledged. Those who had been misunderstood were given the chance to share their hearts. People no longer saw each other as oppressors or victims, as enemies or threats. They saw each other as brothers and sisters. This is how we move forward, not by ignoring history, but by refusing to let history define our relationships today. Not by seeking revenge, but by seeking understanding. Not by holding on to resentment, but by choosing to forgive. Even when it feels impossible, not by dividing ourselves into groups, but by realizing that in Christ we are already one. Jesus turned to me again, his eyes filled with love, but also with a sense of urgency. They must not wait for the world to tell them when to love, he said. They must choose love now. I felt the weight of his words settle deep within me. He wasn't just showing me what could be. He was showing me what must be. It wasn't enough for people to simply hope for unity. It wasn't enough to say the right things publicly while holding on to resentment privately. They had to make the choice to forgive, to love, to heal, and to walk forward together as one. And in that moment, I understood why he had sent me back. The world needed to hear this message, and the time to change wasn't some far-off someday. It was now. Everything around me shifted in an instant. The vision of people uniting, the overwhelming love of Jesus, the hope that had filled my soul. It all faded as I felt something pulling me away. It wasn't sudden or violent, but it was undeniable. It felt as if I was being drawn backward, away from the presence of Jesus, away from the place where I had witnessed so much truth. I turned to him, desperate to hold on, to stay just a little longer. There was so much more I wanted to understand, so much I hadn't asked. But before I could speak, Jesus met my gaze with deep love and unwavering certainty. "Go back," he said. "Tell them." His voice was gentle, yet there was a weight behind it that left no room for hesitation. This wasn't a request. It was a command. Before I could respond, before I could ask how, everything around me collapsed into darkness. The warmth disappeared, the light faded, the peace that had surrounded me moments ago was gone. And then I gasped for air. The cold hit me like a wave, sharp and unforgiving. My lungs burned as they struggled to draw in oxygen, my chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. Every part of me ached. My head throbbed as I became aware of the solid ground beneath me. The world around me felt heavy, too real, too harsh after where I had just been. I wasn't in that heavenly place anymore. I was back. A voice called my name, distant at first, then growing clearer. Someone was shaking me, their hands gripping my shoulders, their panicked breaths visible in the freezing air. I blinked, trying to focus, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Angela, oh my God, are you okay?" The voice was familiar, but it took me a moment to place it. It was my neighbor, the one who had seen me lying motionless on the ground and rushed to my side. I tried to speak, but my lips felt numb, my body still trying to catch up with my spirit. "You weren't breathing," she said, her voice shaky. "I thought you—" "Stop, swallow hard, I called an ambulance. Just stay still." I wasn't sure what to say. How could I explain what had just happened? How could I tell her I had seen Jesus, that I had left this world entirely, been given a message so urgent that he sent me back? There was no time to process any of it. The sirens were approaching, flashing lights reflecting off the icy pavement as the paramedics arrived. They lifted me onto a stretcher, questions being thrown at me, voices overlapping. They checked my pulse, my breathing shining a light into my eyes, trying to understand how I had survived a fall like that, how I had gone without oxygen and was still here, fully conscious. But even as they spoke to me, as they wrapped me in blankets and tried to keep me awake, all I could think about was what I had just left behind. I had died. I had stood before Jesus. I had seen the truth about the world, about humanity, about the way forward. And now I was back. The ride to the hospital was a blur. I answered what little I could, saying I'd slipped on the ice, lost consciousness, didn't remember much after the fall. It was easier than trying to explain what had really happened. No one would believe me if I told them the truth. Not yet, at least. Lying in the hospital bed later, staring up at the ceiling, I felt different. It wasn't just that I had survived something that should have killed me. It was that I wasn't the same person who had fallen that morning. Something inside me had shifted. I could feel it in every part of me, a knowing so deep, it felt like it had been written into my very soul. I'd been sent back for a reason. Jesus had told me to tell them, but tell them what? How could I even begin to put into words what I had seen? How could I explain the way he had looked at humanity, the love in his eyes, the pain he carried for the division and suffering that people continued to inflict on one another? How could I explain the unity that was possible, the healing that was real, the forgiveness that was necessary? The weight of it all pressed against my chest, But beneath it there was something else, a fire, a certainty that I couldn't ignore. I had to speak. It didn't matter if people doubted me. It didn't matter if some rejected what I said. I had been sent back for this moment. I knew I had been given this experience for a reason, and I couldn't stay silent. As I lay there staring at the fluorescent lights above me, I whispered the words to myself, letting them settle deep into my spirit. I will tell them. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning. When I shared what had happened with my family, their reactions were just as I expected, mixed. Some believed me right away. My mother held my hand, tears in her eyes, whispering prayers under her breath as she listened. My sister sat quietly nodding, not questioning a single word, as if she had always known something like this could happen. But others were more skeptical. My husband shifted in his chair, his face full of concern rather than belief. "Angela," he said slowly, "you hit your head hard. The doctor said it's a miracle you didn't suffer worse injuries. Maybe your mind was trying to make sense of what happened." I understood why he was hesitant. It was easier for him to believe that my experience was a trauma-induced hallucination than the undeniable truth that I had died and been sent back for a purpose. But this wasn't something I needed to convince anyone of. "I know what I saw," I told him. "I know what I heard." He sighed, rubbing his face, still unsure, but I could see it, the small hesitation in his doubt, the tiny part of him that wanted to believe me, but was too afraid to. And that was okay, because this wasn't just about convincing my family. I had to speak. At first, I wasn't sure how to begin. How do you tell people something so monumental? How do you explain that Jesus himself sent you back with a message? That he showed you what humanity had gotten wrong and told you to warn them? I wasn't a preacher. I wasn't someone with influence. I was just a regular woman who had gone to church her whole life, followed the routines of faith, and done what I thought was right. Yet somehow, I had been entrusted with this. So I decided to start with my church. The Sunday after I was released from the hospital, I sat in the pews like I always had. But nothing felt the same. The songs, the prayers, the words being spoken, they all felt different now. It wasn't that they were wrong. It was that I had seen something deeper, something beyond the routine of worship. At the end of the service, I asked my pastor if I could speak. He hesitated, probably unsure of what I was about to say. But eventually, he handed me the microphone. I stepped up to the front of the church, my heart pounding. The faces staring back at me were familiar, people I had known for years, people who had prayed with me, worshipped beside me, lived their lives in faith as best as they knew how. I took a deep breath. "I died," I murmured. A wave of whispers spread through the congregation, a hushed buzz filling the silence. Some looked at me with confusion, others leaned in, captivated by the tension of what I was about to say. I slipped on the ice, hit my head, and I died, I continued. But that wasn't the end. I stood before Jesus. I saw him, and he showed me things I can't keep to myself. The room grew so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I began to share everything I had seen. I spoke about the pain of division, how humanity had spent so much time separating itself, clinging to race, status, and history instead of to Christ. I told them how Jesus had wept for the way people treated one another, how he had shown me that so many of us had been deceived into thinking our differences mattered more than our unity in him. I told them how the church itself had become part of the problem, how people who claimed to follow Jesus had still allowed separation to exist within their own walls. Some people cried openly, wiping their tears. Others sat in silence, their faces pale and unreadable. A few looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as if my words were pressing on something they weren't ready to confront. But I didn't stop. I shared how Jesus hadn't just shown me the problem, but the answer: forgiveness, unity, love. A true return to him, not just in words, but in action. He showed me that people needed to stop letting the world tell them how to see one another and start seeing each other through his eyes. He showed me that healing wasn't about ignoring the past, but choosing to move forward in love instead of bitterness. I told them that the enemy wanted to keep people divided, because a divided church was a weak church, and a weak church couldn't fulfill its purpose. And then I shared the last words Jesus had said to me before I returned. Go back. Tell them. The weight of those words filled the room, pressing on everyone listening. I stepped back, handing the microphone to my pastor. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he took it. He was shaken, just like the rest of the congregation. After a long silence, he finally spoke. I don't know what to say, he admitted, but I believe you. That was all it took. From that moment on, the word spread. Some people left church that day, unable to look me in the eye. Some avoided me entirely, unwilling to face what I had said. But others came to me, tears streaming down their faces. As I spoke, people began to open up. They came to me, telling me they felt something shift inside them as I shared the message, that deep down, they knew what I was saying was true. And then it started to happen. Conversations began, confessions were made, and people reconciled. I saw individuals who had never acknowledged each other before suddenly reaching out, breaking down the walls they'd built. Real conversations about race, history, and faith began, not to argue, not to assign blame, but to heal. Churches that had always been separate started coming together, praying as one, choosing unity over division. This wasn't just my story. It wasn't about me at all. It was about Jesus calling his people back, and I had no choice but to keep speaking. Because once you've seen what I've seen, once you've stood before Jesus and heard the sorrow in his voice, once you've been sent back with a mission, you can't stay silent. The world needed to hear this, and I was going to make sure they did. We were never meant to live divided. That was never God's plan. From the very beginning, we were created in his image, made to reflect his love, his kindness, his unity. But the world twisted that truth, convincing us that our differences mattered more than what we shared in common. History left wounds, deep scars passed down from generation to generation. Instead of healing, those wounds were reopened, time and time again, keeping people separated by race, culture, and wrongs that were never meant to define the future. But Jesus showed me the truth. I saw the pain, the division, how it had consumed people. Anger, resentment, and fear had taken the place of love. Some were burdened by the weight of oppression, struggling to move forward because of the past. Others were trapped by guilt, unsure how to make things right, afraid to say the wrong thing. In the midst of it all, the enemy was watching, feeding the fire, using division as his greatest weapon. He knew that a broken and divided people could never be strong. But Jesus never intended for us to carry the burdens of history as weapons against each other. He never wanted us to let pain dictate how we love. He didn't ignore suffering. He didn't pretend injustice didn't exist. But he also didn't allow it to be greater than his love. The only way forward is through him. That was the message Jesus sent me back with. That was the truth I had to speak, no matter who was willing to hear it. It wasn't enough to simply acknowledge the past. People had to choose to move beyond it, choose to heal, reconcile, and forgive. That didn't mean forgetting or pretending everything had always been right. It meant learning from the past without letting it control the future. It meant choosing forgiveness over anger, unity over division, love over hate. Jesus made it clear that the world's solutions would never work. The world tells us that justice means payback, that peace comes from silence, that unity is impossible. But Jesus showed me that true peace, real healing, and unity only come through Him. So now I ask you, what will you do with this message? Will you let go of the chains that have held you back? Will you choose to see others the way Jesus sees them? Not as enemies, not as strangers, but as brothers and sisters. Will you forgive, not because the past doesn't matter, but because Jesus is greater than the past? I don't know who needed to hear this today, but I know Jesus didn't show me these things for no reason. He didn't send me back to stay silent. He sent me back to tell you that He is calling His people to come together, to stop letting the world dictate how we see each other, to stop allowing the enemy to divide us. This is the final warning. It is time to return to Him fully, completely, without hesitation. It is time to lay down everything that has kept us apart, to break the chains of resentment, to stop letting the world decide how we treat each other. It is time to come back to the truth that, in Jesus, we are one. This is what He revealed to me. Now it's up to you to decide what to do with it. Thank you for watching. If this message spoke to you, like, share, and subscribe so more people can hear this truth. Jesus is calling us back, and the time to respond is now.